I'm very excited, always am, but with even more glee, actually, to be starting the 2-year cycle again with the ancients. Putting together this volume took a lot of energy on all of our parts at Abigail Adams, and it was worth it because we start with Gilgamesh, the first real example of literature we have in world history. And we go all the way to St. Augustine and one of the books from the Confessions. What that span covers is, of course, not only thousands of years and a procession of civilizations, but sets up the whole question of how we should live from its primal beginnings. The question is asked as the primary motor of Gilgamesh, the question of mortality and what it means to try to make sense of existence, knowing that everyone you love will die and we ourselves will die. That theme gets urgently re-asked in the way that each of us has to re-ask it. It's not a canned question. It is a thing that has to be existentially lived. And so we see it pop up again, obviously, in the Iliad, though we don't do that work of Homer this time, we do the Odyssey, but it's there in the Odyssey too, with regard to the question of how one gains knowledge, what is worth knowing, and what does it mean to come home again, right? Can we find a home in this world? And then we're off to the races, right? We've got Genesis up through the Abraham narrative, which tells of a leaving home to go into the undiscovered country of the future, into a place where there is only strangeness, and to transcend where one comes from, to start a new life. That again also is a way that we have to each grapple with, is this fact of a dialectic of home and the foreign, and this dynamism between what is I'm getting a notice now that my internet connection is unstable, so please do let me know if there's a problem. But
it's okay, a slight delay, David, but it's okay, keep going.
Okay, so civilization is this project that we all engage in individually and together as a whole human kind, in different cultural groups, and then each of us. You take it back to the root. Civilis is related to civitas, which is the Latin word for city, and that I do think is the way to ground our notion of civilization, that it's a city-based and urbanized kind of reality, which is not to leave out the fact of all of the lives lived outside of the city centers, because of course that's what sustains life in the city. And it's still the case that, well, less so now. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the time we're in, where more the shift from rural to urban has really become far different than ever in the history of the world. But when we had the first group of cities in southern Mesopotamia, right, what would be southern Iraq right now, we had the concentration of human personalities necessary to generate the advances that we know of as culture and civilization, that is writing above all. The cuneiform system of writing is even behind our current alphabet. The density of cities makes possible the creation of new ways of being, and that's why we know that the whole project of civilization is a matter of conversation, of coming together with different ways of being and trying to creatively forge a path forward that is different from what has been before. Now, we in America are especially concerned with Western civilization, quote unquote. I think that's absolutely urgent, but I think it's also paradoxical because the question of East and West is something we're going to track throughout the cycle, actually, of the 2-year cycle, but it's very much to the fore in this first semester. Where does Western civilization begin? Well, it's hard to start anywhere but with the Mesopotamian civilization, which is, of course, now the Middle East, right? It is East. Now, for our history, the Muslim transfiguration of the geopolitical order in the 7th century, beginning of the 7th century, that obviously is a fact that's still a fact of the world. But it's too easy, and this is one reason that I'm so grateful that Danilo, when we always include a few new authors, recycle others, but when he said we should do Herodotus, that's not something I've been very familiar with, but that question of East and West is something Herodotus himself sets up. And I think he does so in ways that are, Herodotus is thinking about the Greeks versus the Persians, West versus East. Okay. Is Greece for us East or West? If you think about the history of the Roman Empire, when it becomes divided into Western and Eastern halves, parts, is the word what went, the Western half became Latin speaking exclusively, when the ruling class previously had been both Latin and Greek speaking in theory. And then the Eastern half reverted to Greek. Okay, so Byzantium, as we call that world now, is that East or West? Right? As Roman, usually when we say Roman, we mean we think of the fall of the Roman Empire, we mean the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The East didn't fall for another 1,000 years. I mean, these are conundrums. We take it all the way back to Homer. If you think about the Trojan War as somehow, as Herodotus does, right? If we take that as East and West, well, that's interesting, because Troy, according to the founding myth that Virgil gives us, is at the root of Rome, right? You have Aeneas escaping the ashes. So Troy would be East, I guess, except even with Homer, you find they have the same culture, they have the same gods, they have presumably the same language. So I don't think East and West, I don't think that's nonsensical language, but I do think it's problematic language. And I think it's language we have to keep exploring so that we can understand what it means to preserve, maybe that's not even the best word, right? To advance Western civilization from where we are right now. It's one of the things I find most exciting about this semester, right? You start from those first cities, which are Sumerian, which is not related to any ethnicity or language group we know of. The surrounding area is Semitic, which is ultimately the group that includes both Jews and Arabs. Indo-European surrounds all of this. So India and Greece have very strong connections in terms of thought, for instance, and a lot of this is built on trade routes that developed with the cities, right? Once the cities began in Mesopotamia, a few centuries later, you had cities beginning in the Indus Valley, and then of course in the Nile River Valley, and they all started trading. And that contact with foreign ways of being was an incentive to new creation. Okay, so that the Western world early on, if one wants to speak of it this way, goes from in the Indus Valley all the way to the Nile River Valley, right? That's the matrix anyway, out of which any reasonable reading of Western civilization has to be said to come from, right? It's that Near Eastern matrix. Okay, so you have this, what Vogelin, picking up on the Greek geographers, calls the ecumene, that is the known world to people up until we had global maps, right? The known world was always some subset of the world, and we can call that the ecumene, the inhabited world. The ecumene for the Mesopotamians reached from, say, Egypt to India. As the Greeks under Alexander the Great, spread Hellenism all the way back to India, right? That translation of that commerce from the east and west going back and forth. He defeated the Persians, right? The east. He goes all the way beyond the east, as it were, to India. Okay, so under Alexander, the Greek way of life dominates the whole Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. Okay. While that's going on, a power is consolidating in the West, Rome. It defeats the Phoenician-derived Carthaginians, right? The Phoenicians are Semitic peoples from which we get our alphabet. They're defeated. Rome defeats Carthage, gains hegemony over the Western Mediterranean, eventually, as we know, pushes up to Britain, pushes up to the Rhine, the Danube, and into Mesopotamia, but never really penetrates all the way into Mesopotamia and never gets farther. That is Alexander the Great, his empire is all the way over to the east. Rome is controlling the ecumene of the Mediterranean, literal, the shoreline. Okay, so there's still these two major centers now, Latin and Greek. What complicates that further is that the cultural substance of the Romans is so heavily dependent on the Greek. Again, that's reflected in the founding myth of coming from Troy, because Troy itself it's very, well, certainly it's Eastern Mediterranean, but it's also very Greek. Okay, so we have this interplay between East and West. When the Western half of the Roman Empire collapses, what's left? We have Catholic Christianity, we have Augustinian Christianity that does keep the flame of civilization alive in the Western part of the former empire. We have Eastern Christianity still tied to an empire in the Eastern part of the Mediterranean. And then we have this new world power, the Islamic. As far as the readings, 8 of the readings, which reflects what I've just gone over, are originally written in Greek. And that includes the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote in Greek because that was, I mean, truly to be cultured still, even when in the 3rd century was to, in the 2nd century was still to be Greek. So we have the readings from the era, the foundational time of civilization, the beginning of cities with Gilgamesh, which really is such an extraordinary work to begin with. It is a breathtaking poem. We go to Genesis, which is clearly playing off of Mesopotamian myths, including Gilgamesh. It's quite clear, for instance, the flood story is in some way derived or derived from the flood story that we have in Gilgamesh. Genesis gives us a story about the beginning of the world that is that is transcending mythology, but that is meant to not be seen as somehow floating above the Near Eastern milieu. I mean, it's part and parcel of that world. Then we go to Homer, which if you have the Gilgamesh in your head, you're gonna feel these themes when you're reading the Odyssey. This is our first time to do it in the Great Conversation. It is, of course, the great adventure story. It is a very dramatic representation of our zeal for new experiences and what we're willing to risk for that, but still the desire to come home with it. And then we go on to, what is it? I think the beginning of philosophy with Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus in particular, just like Nietzsche, 2 of the thinkers that really get participants going are Heraclitus and Nietzsche, and they are similar in various ways. So we get those 2 together, representing the emergence of philosophy. We then go on to Sophocles, representing the great golden age of Athens. Athens is so much at the heart of the story that we have to tell about Western civilization, about Hellenism. And Sophocles with Antigone is giving us a truly classic presentation of the demands that tear us apart, between a transcendent claim on us and a political claim on us. And that's a very we never get beyond that kind of dialectic either. Then we go to Herodotus, who comes from the same land that philosophy begins in. It is in the Ionian, the western coast of Turkey. And he brings that kind of medical desire to get the facts, and that's the beginning of history. That is something distinct from myth, as a way of explaining the world, to kind of give us a causal account. And this is very much related to the Ionian breakthrough in philosophy. And he's representing still Athens too, because when he comes to live in Athens for a few years, he does so in the age of Pericles, and he's representing that viewpoint in his work. Then we, of course, come to the great apology of Socrates, in which Plato is presenting the great martyr to truth, the great martyr of philosophy, Socrates, and how that figure shows us what it might mean to live a life under this transcendent command, to seek the truth, to be true to the truth, no matter what your social norms might require, even if they might require something different from you. And that Plato and Socrates are the great fountainhead, really, of philosophy. But then Aristotle, so it's this remarkable age. If we want to say, why is Athens celebrated? Well, we have this unparalleled emergence of minds with Socrates, Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle. The Nicomachean Ethics is not as Aristotle doesn't write in a literary way the way Plato does. But every time I read the Ethics, I'm struck by how the clarity. I mean, a lot of that analysis is already in Plato, and the dialogue form is so beautiful. But there is something very beautiful about the clarity of the systematic argumentation to be found in Aristotle. And lest we forget, he was for many years the teacher of Alexander the Great. And I think this doesn't get dwelt on enough. I mean, that's a world historical fact that Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, taught one of the greatest conquerors. I mean, probably the greatest conqueror of all time. And Alexander is a figure who's going to float in the background here. We go then to Plutarch, who's already, he's a Greek, but under the Roman Empire, right? By the time Rome had swallowed up Greece. And he's still writing in Greek, and he's writing in our selection about Alcibiades, who's this extraordinary figure from the time of the Peloponnesian War, the time in which the Athenian glory came to its catastrophic self-destruction. And we read about, I think this is very important for Americans, because the more I study the history of Athens, the more I think the parallels with America are very strong. The military might of the Greeks is so, it's hard for us to understand that they were amazing warriors. That was essential. So we think of them as thinkers and cultural trailblazers, but it was founded on this power of arms, and that is something we need to consider. And so American power is just a fact. It's like the brute fact of geopolitics. What do we do with that, right? Is a democracy, as Athens was, compatible with such power? Can you have democracy without such power? Can you keep democracy with such power? These are the questions we want to ask. And then we go on to Virgil with a couple of books from the Aeneid, the book on where Aeneas leaves behind that love, Dido in Carthage, to fulfill his mission. And then where we get the great imperial rationalization of Book 6. Why is Rome supposed to be the master of the world? And also reflected there is the switch from the late Republic with its terrible civil wars to the Principate of Augustus. And then we go to the good emperor Marcus Aurelius, a true philosopher king, and his Stoic meditations. And we end with Augustine, who, again, this is not a Christian enterprise, the Great Conversation. Many of us are Christians, and we want to bring that to the table. But the point of having Augustine here isn't because he's a Christian, it's because no fair accounting of the West can leave Augustine out. He is the architect of the Western mind. I'm as a distinctive thing that the Latin mind, I am convinced, is a creation of Saint Augustine. So we'll see this remarkable, get a taste of his Confessions, which is really the first full-scale autobiography, and how he does help construct the kind of subjectivity, our sense of ourselves that we still have.